You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. On today's episode, I have a conversation with Vicky Osterweil, a fellow member of her new writing collective, CAW, and the author of the indispensable history and provocation, In Defense of Looting, as well as a forthcoming book on intellectual property and Disney called The Extended Universe. We decided to have this conversation in the opening month of the Trump administration to game out some possible scenarios as we observed the administration demolishing the constitutional and administrative state against all establishment assurances that the institutions can withstand any attack. Though our conversation does engage the fear and threat of the situation, we also discuss openings for us to take bold action that uses this moment of bad revolution to expand our collective power. Vicky is one of my favorite people to talk with. She has a brilliant analytical mind, an incredible store of political history and knowledge, and an inspiring way to read the devastating moments with a belief in the necessity to act. In fact, Vicky emphasizes the potential timeline of power consolidation by these fascist forces and the urgency for us to prepare ourselves for managing our lives and mounting attack. This was recorded at the end of February, so of course there have been new terrible political developments, but the analysis itself still stands as a way for us to assess the possibilities. If you haven't already, please go over to cawshinythings.com and sign up to read the works that Vicky, me, and the amazing Carla Joy Bergman and Danny Burleson are sharing there. Things have been incredibly difficult for me and everyone, but I'm coming back to regular recording and writing, so stay tuned. My column there is called She's Not There, but all of us are posting articles, essays, writing prompts, and other recordings. There's plenty for you to sink your teeth into. And we will also be offering other kinds of projects. The online journal is currently open to subscribers, but will pivot soon to a subscription service with a pay-what-you-want option. Check it out and help spread the word. As always, if you want to submit a question, scenario, or problem for us to discuss from an anarchist, autonomous, queer perspective of ending things, you can write us at forum.jotforum.com/thebreakuptheory/stories or call us at 917-526-6548. We have a couple agony letter episodes coming up, and we'd love to hear from you, so send anything you want in. If you like this podcast, please share with your friends, rate us, and follow us wherever it is you receive pods. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. CZN will help you discover a library of amazing audio projects, so check them out at channelzeronetwork.com. So I'm here with my fellow CAW member, Vicky Osterweil, to just have a kind of wide-ranging discussion about what's going on now, based in analysis of the current political situation, and then also practical ideas about how we might respond to it or things that we might do to get through it.
Yeah, it's so exciting to be here. Thanks for having me, Shili.
Oh yeah, I just love talking to you. So, I mean, you've also been writing a series of texts that I have found really helpful and useful to comprehend what's going on. And, you know, one of the things that I've been really struck with is this tendency for us, I'm going to just say a general us, to say, oh, you know, this thing, they say they're going to do this thing, or this thing's happening, but surely it's not going to be as bad as it seems, or surely there's like some check on this grab at power. And it's gone from, you know, the beginning of Trump's candidacy, even back, you know, for the 2016 election, that it surely isn't going to be as bad as he says. And then, you know, with that mentality, we keep getting disproven that it is what they say. They're doing the things that they say they're going to do. And even the belief that institutionally there will be something to hold it up seems not to be actually happening. I still find myself going into that place, right? Like, you know, we'll still have Medicaid, or
yeah.
I don't know what do you have thoughts on just this, like this, how we might shift that, or how we need to shift that kind of idea?
So yeah, I think like what you're saying basically is that aside from how to get treated for COVID, if you just believed everything Trump said literally over the last 8 years, you would have a better analysis of what he was going to do than most of the experts and stuff who, you know, sort of assure us that violates norms and that breaks the Constitution, or that he doesn't have the power to do that, whatever. And I think that's become really, really clear. I think people need to accept that at the moment, the Constitution is not functional. The law is not functional as it applies to him. It's still functional as it applies to us, of course. But it is not, and de facto, there are the checks and balances, which if you have a sort of anarchist or radical analysis in general, you have always insisted is in fact theoretical. If someone refused to do it, it is actually just a nicety. Well, it turns out we are now in that scenario. So if you don't have that analysis, I think this is probably more upsetting and confusing. But I think even, folks like you and me who are used to a certain kind of world persisting and who are used to the function of the US state largely being to maintain that world, right? And that like we recognize and critique how important this sort of liberalism is to the functioning of the state, right? And we talk about how there's like all this ideology to make things function normally and make things function usually. So even a lot of people who are radical and who have a radical analysis of power in the state are blindsided by someone at the top of the state ripping apart many of his own tools in the name of pursuing a kind of power that, in fact, as we have said over and over again, the US more or less gives its executive branch anyway, right? So part of what's confusing, I think, is that people don't understand or don't want to accept that there is a combination of extreme ignorance about the actual functioning of the state, the actual reason these things exist, and a sheer willingness to rip it to pieces with experts behind them who can tell them how to do that. So there is a competence at present in ripping apart the order, and there is an incompetence in that they do not appreciate like why they shouldn't do that, right? The reason that states have accepted the liberal global order for so long, and here I mean liberal lower L, neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, the reason they've accepted that is because it tends to keep, for example, people from murdering presidents, people from overthrowing governments, and therefore destabilizing financial regimes. And so while in, the third world or the colonial outskirts or many, places where there's a lot of indigenous sovereignty, the liberal order has been very happy to overthrow things and do coups. That was always on the basis of keeping the stability of the center, right?
Mhm.
The metropole, the US, the stability of DC, of the federal government, which is also the stability of the global financial system, because the US dollar is the backstop of all economic activity in the world, was the paramount concern for capitalists and has been for a century. It is very weird that that is not operating right now. It is very confusing that at the very top of the state, the people who wield that, what we know to be basically infinite power, have decided that they would rather bum rush the state in order to get at their perceived enemies, to destroy, Democrats, liberals, the deep state, civil society, whatever, to reinstate segregation on the way to reinstating slavery. We don't know exactly what their goals are. I mean, a lot of the, Silicon Valley people want to destroy the federal government and then build company towns of which, they are kings, right? They want to sort of destabilize, return to like 16th century politics with like 21st century technology. Trump probably doesn't have a theory of state operating at all and just wants to have power and be rich, and also is in full King Lear mode, I think, right now. Like I genuinely like if you watched him on the campaign trail, like he just doesn't have it anymore. He doesn't have the charisma. He's not with it. So anyway, I'm getting into the weeds here, but I think like to answer the question, we have to accept the situation as it is. It has been a month. It was shocking. It is confusing. It is upsetting. And we rely on lots of stuff from the federal government, like Medicaid. And if that were to disappear, it's going to be really confusing what's going to happen. And it's really scary what's going to happen. But the thing is, if the Medicaid goes away, the doctors and the hospitals where that provision happens don't go away. And they're also people. And if it happens all at once, they will know it's happening all at once. And they've been hit too, right? So part of why I think you'll hear me sort of over this conversation, and like part of why my analysis I think is less doomery in some ways than other people's is because I think the constitutional regime is over. I think that the regime that has ruled over this continent from 1865 or maybe 1877, depending on how you think about Reconstruction, very different conversation, has ended in 2025. I think we are in a new space, but it is not settled what that space is going to look like, and that means that things are going to change really rapidly in a lot of different ways. But the way that they've done it is really sloppy. They've hit everyone all at once.
Yeah.
because they wanted to do this to us. They wanted to get rid of Medicaid. They wanted to genocide trans people and immigrants. They wanted to, take Black people out of all positions of power and prestige. These were their goals. They always were their goals. And if you didn't believe they were their goals, maybe you're finding it hard to accept this moment. But I think most people who would be listening to this podcast probably believed, at least on some level, that those were their goals. We knew it. Even the Democrats called them fascists. They just didn't act like they were fascists, right?
Right.
So the question then becomes, how effectively are they going to do those things? It's not
Yeah.
about whether they want to, and it's not about whether they can in terms of legal regimes, in terms of the Constitution, in terms of laws, because they're not operating on those bases. It's how well will people follow their orders? How well will society agree to put these consequences in place? Because, okay, so Medicaid fails for everyone. So do doctors just stop seeing patients and they just shut down the hospital? Maybe they do that, and that's terrifying. But maybe some of them don't. And those are scary, hard questions to be facing. But the only reason policy up till now has been law and law has been policy, and those two things together have affected the material world, is because the hierarchy has accepted and respected the rule of law. And they have very, very quickly ripped that up. And that means that things are going to be very different and very chaotic.
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting up that sort of scenario. There's a lot that I was like want to respond to in what you were saying. I mean, because like the moment, right? You're saying 2025 marks this kind of breaking moment in terms of the constitutional order, but I think we can also look at a history that's led up to this, right? Like the contradictions that seem to be coming to head now have been set up over the last 50 years plus very, very explicitly. And it's funny because it's done through it's precisely a contradiction, right? If you think about the Supreme Court and the Federalist Society, their claim is strict constitutionalism. Their actions have nothing to do with the Constitution. They can manipulate their interpretations to be actually opposed to what the Constitution says, to just like impose whatever order they want. And within the system that of the U.S. government, the Democrats, who are the opposing party, the Republicans, have always acted like this is in good faith, that this is actually constitutional, that we can follow the rules to get to this. That connects to the sort of liberal order that's persisted for a long time. I think is just traces back to the Constitution and goes forward as this progressive idea of history, right? That the Constitution, when that was put in place, that it was a breakage in history that leads to a continual progress that will give individual people rights, and the free market and all that stuff. So there's that persistent belief. I think even within all of us, like know analytically that it's not true. Now, I've been thinking a lot about that fact, about how this stuff gets actually imposed. And because the Constitution is just this piece of paper, right? It's a fiction that only becomes real through people obeying or through, application, which at the end of the line you trace to a gun in your face, right? It doesn't always happen that way, but it's only can be enforceable through the state having the monopoly on violence, or however you want to say it. But also just our willingness to think of ourselves as citizens who follow these rules. So in that situation, like you've been talking about in this, in your last comment, I've been really considering the possibilities of people in different positions refusing to obey orders. And we've seen that. But we've also seen people rushing before anything has been put in place to follow alongside what Trump is saying, whether it's, the doctors at NYU Langone canceling puberty blocker appointments for trans kids, or different city governments ripping apart their DEI stuff before that's actually been made into any kind of law. So there's a lot of people doing that. There's people trying to refuse and do it to a certain extent and then give in. And then there's all these resignations, which are like moral stances that actually open the door for the people to do the things that they're supposedly opposing. When it comes to Medicaid, for example, I was recently in a doctor's appointment and talking about trans stuff. And she's like, well, this is like a LGBT medical center. And she's like, well, I only rely on federal stuff for my malpractice insurance, which was interesting to know. But that, right, the malpractice stuff is like one of the things that reins in doctors actions pretty intensely. So I don't know. I like to have the hope that you're saying that if everything falls apart, kind of the laws behind the infrastructure, that some people will continue the infrastructure that's actually beneficial to people based on, that kind of crisis or disaster response where we come together to do mutual aid spontaneously and without need for instruction. But I wonder about the persistence of some of these things, like fear of being sued, or whatever things that have actually constructed our engagement with the system as individuals. So I guess I have a little bit more pessimistic view. I believe it's possible for people to refuse, but I'm not sure that there's a culture of that at this point that allows for it. And simultaneously, like as anarchists, we've wanted the destruction of the state, and we're watching it happen in a way that's disastrous to everyone. So what do we do? The people who like definitely who refuse all the time, while we watch this kind of internal deconstruction of the state?
Yeah, so I would challenge a few things you said, but I do want to first start by saying that like my description of their errors and their sloppiness and the chaotic way they're doing that is not meant to describe it as ineffective in terms of causing harm and in terms of consolidating power. It is doing those things effectively. It is going to cause tremendous harm. I think it's very, very bad that we're in this situation. I am not an accelerationist. Like, I don't think that like this is good in the way that you say things are good or bad. It is just a situation. This is the situation we find ourselves in. And the faster we accept that, the sooner we can move appropriately. So, yes, I think that it is scary that we now are facing a situation where we are going to have to rely on refusal from people. I don't think that there's no culture of refusal. I think if we were in the UK right now, for example, if we had had the social movement history of the UK over the last 15 years, or like most of Northern Europe, we'd be so fucked. But like the US has had 15 years of extremely powerful upheaval that has like both been shaped by and helped drive global resistance to capital and neoliberalism. Yes, the last 4 years have been very quiet. People were effectively, de-radicalized by the way that I believe, by the way, mostly that Biden dealt with COVID. I think that COVID was used as a wedge to smash solidarities and introduce eugenic and fascist logics into the publics that were then really codified by Gaza, right? So actually, part of why I'm quote unquote optimistic in this moment is because when Trump won the election, I was like, well, that's it. It's the camps. Here we fucking go. This is it. Fascism is here. I got really depressed, honestly, because in order to keep functioning through 2024, I had convinced myself, and I even wrote about it. I was wrong. I had convinced myself there was no way he was going to win again because it was so disastrous. And I just couldn't bring myself to campaign for Kamala or Biden because they're fucking genocidaires. But also, I don't really believe that stuff is capable of producing change on local levels. And there's a whole other stuff behind that. Whatever. We're not relitigating that. Thank God. But the point is, I told myself, like, no, 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 there's no way he can win. He's lost his charisma. He's lost his juice. His movement is disorganized. The streets are quiet for him. If you like watched his rallies, like people were leaving early, like it was like like it was like the last game in like a season, and they just sort of came out, but they were like, oh, well, I left the oven on, I think, oh, I gotta get rid of the babysitter, He just didn't have the juice he had in 2016 or even 2020, right? So that didn't end up mattering because I, as ever, underestimated the anti-appeal of the Democrats. The one election season I ever overestimated the Democrats, which normally I try not to do. But whatever, that was functional for me. That was important for me. As soon as that happened, though, I was like, okay, so now we're in the scenario where we are on a timeline towards the concentration camps. We are on a timeline towards total open genocide of like trans people, like me and my people and my community. Like, I need to have plans to get out of the country. Like, that was my sort of immediate thought, right? And I think what happened with that was because that was where I was. So, like, a lot of people, a lot of my comrades told me, I don't really think you're right. Like, I think Trump's going to win, But they also had convinced themselves in that acceptance for 2024 that also Trump was going to be just kind of like the first regime. Whereas
Yeah.
what I was doing, the gesture I was doing was actually wrong about the election. But I was wrong about the election because I was listening to what Trump was saying and I was like, well, this is fucking terrifying. If he gets in power, we are so fucked. At the Republican National Convention, they're holding mass deportation now signs. It's a fucking like Albert Speer, like fucking rally, like organized Nazi rally. So but what that does mean is that the moment that I got over that shock, it was a few days when I got over that sort of fear response, I began thinking in terms of, okay, this is the fascist coup. It is here. It is happening. Like the norms don't apply. There probably won't be more elections. Like there
Right.
won't be another set of elections. That allowed me to like start thinking that way. And I think the sooner all of us start thinking that way, the easier we'll be able to see the refusal. Right. Okay. So let me combine those two threads. Basically, so we had this mass resistance. And as soon as the regime started, literally within a week, I started getting relieved because what Trump had done was found a successful wedge with trans people. And what Biden had done and the Democrats had done was successfully repress the movements by smashing solidarity via Gaza and COVID. And so they were handing power. They had said that they were fascists and they were handing them power. So what they were demonstrating to the rest of the country who is not like me or you, like, constantly thinking about these things, they were demonstrating that in fact there was no threat. What they did was they handed Trump and his administration a perfect situation to like frog in the pot, turn on fascism. What they had to do was just spend the last month that they've spent just attacking trans rights. Now, if they attacked trans rights, what that would have happened is that you would have had hospitals and universities who you pointed out were already like primed and they were ready to accept. They would have rolled over and trans people and queer people and activists would have been angry and upset and they would have been alone and they would have been isolated and they would have been successfully repressed. And then Trump and Musk riding on the goodwill from the Democrats who were trying to make things normal, like they could have then like sort of, consolidated power. It wouldn't have taken that long, but they're too fucking impatient and stupid for that, right? Genuinely. They genuinely don't believe in the existence of other people who are capable of saying no, largely because they've never experienced it. Most fascist movements that are successful were like from Modi, Suharto, like down to like, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. All of those parties, those fascist parties, were born in crucibles of civil war and like extreme campaigning, right? They really had to like fight for that. And so they built apparatuses that were incredibly politically powerful hierarchies, that were then capable of enacting their will. And so they had a relatively good strategic vision of how to take power over the state. Those people all still lost. Those people still failed in the end, but they did enough damage to shape the world in their image, right? Trump overcame a Republican Party that was like doomed to irrelevance and a Democratic Party that was like little better, right? Trump has overcome no, and his team has never overcome a hardship. And they spent the last 4 years in literal denial about what has happened, right? And the Democrats just didn't give them any trouble except for some lawsuits that they could just swat away by delaying. None of this means the situation is good, but but what they did instead of doing a wedge with trans folks and taking apart the universities and taking apart scientists and taking apart the activists and then going for health centers and then starting to take apart the federal government is they hit everyone at once and they made everyone angry. We've had protests every day in DC for the last 3 weeks. There hadn't been there hadn't been like consistent protesting in DC in years. They have initiated everyone. People were quieted by the Biden administration's 4 years and the counter revolution that Biden, I think, very, very well pulled off. But they didn't forget about 2020 or 2011 or 2014 or 2018 or the airport shutdown in 2016. Some people are too young for that, but not many. That's pretty
Yeah.
recent. So all of which is to say, we are now in a moment where I think that they have really fumbled the coup and they are incredibly weak and vulnerable and people are angry. And part of the reason they've done that is because the two people at the top, Musk and Trump, are extremely, extremely bad at organizing. They're undisciplined and they don't really give a shit.
And they're both idiots.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't know anything about how anything works. And Trump is literally, I think Trump has literally is in cognitive decline, serious cognitive decline.
Yeah.
But they're authoritarians, so they actually follow the leader. And because Trump acts like a bully and a landlord who's never actually had to struggle, he has always valued loyalty over capacity. And what really good fascist leaders and dictators do is like build a bureaucracy and a party full of loyal and capable people, right?
Right.
And they will,
Good
and
point.
if they have to choose between one, they'll choose loyalty, but they do that slowly, and that's a slow vetting process that they do over time. And what Trump in 2020, in the last 4 years, has done is purged everyone who is capable, but even slightly offensive to him personally. So it'll be a year, 6 months, maybe a year, maybe before they actually have the state in hand in a real way. They will get it. If they are not overthrown, they will get the state in hand. It will happen like the inertia of power. I mean, maybe the economy will maybe you know, Trump will send out the wrong Truth Social post and like literally detonate the global economy by threatening the balance of funds. I don't know. But if there's a scenario in which they successfully take control, but right now they do not have it. They do not have solid hold on the state right now. And and we'll talk about this a bit more as we get into like what we want to do. They have really actively alienated their entire bureaucracy, their entire power apparatus, including and in perhaps most high profile fashion, the military.
Right. I mean, that's the important thing to consider. I think that any kind of whatever takeover needs the military on its side. Like they do have the police, they do have ICE, right? Which are armed groups that have significant force, but the military doesn't seem to be under their control. And even some of the like quote unquote deep state, to the extent that they don't get purged, are not going to be super happy with Trump. And yeah, I think also we see him doing the thing where he's like, we're going to replace all of the functionaries in the government with loyalists. But you are also right to point out that they're incompetent because they're flooding them with these like really young people who have no experience and no idea and no desire really to do these kinds of jobs. They just believe in something or have proven that they believe in something, this like Project 2025. I think also, yeah, this idea, people like to talk about how Trump and Musk are both most interested and involved in all of this from self-interest. Like, that what's driving Musk is being able to, get the government to give him favorable situations for his ventures or whatever. And Trump is like, whatever, wants to get again revenge on all the people. Like he's not super interested in actually governing. He likes to be the dictator or whatever. So I think that's interesting because I wonder to what extent that's helpful. And I want to take this like back to your important point, right? That we have this recent history of a decade and a half of repeated instances of uprising, which I forgot that was a point that had always kept me optimistic because I believe that that sort of accelerated pattern of uprisings. Because if we think back to like 68 and then before that, right? Like there's larger chunks of time between all
Yeah.
the actually effective street movements until we get to 2010, and then it starts accelerating up to now, including I think, which you didn't mention. I think it's like questionable to a certain extent the Gaza solidarity stuff here, encampments, and also just like the constant protests. So
Mhm.
so that I think means that there's possibilities in the future, and all the people who've been involved in that, which is like the last few generations of leftists and radicals, have built a lot of skills that will come to bear in ways that we can't predict, because I believe all this stuff happens like kind of spontaneously. You can't plan exactly when or what is going to happen. You can plan other things. But then you have, leftist commentators don't want to take that in consideration because they don't believe that those things are actually like revolutionary. And so when they can see, even so, they almost align with the Democrats in their analysis because they'll be like, this is fascism, but within a structure where everything is going to reassert itself because people are going to become so upset with it because of, if you take away Social Security and Medicaid, you lose the vote, which maybe that's not going to happen again. So I want to go back to Gaza because that's the most recent breaking point. Because as you said, there's protests every day now, but they're pretty successfully muted by the media, which is another force at play here. But the Gaza stuff, right? Like we had the encampments in the US and actually internationally. And some things are continuing that though they don't get a lot of reporting. The encampments had radical practice mixed with reformist discourse, I think. And I think you can get really disappointed. Like, I got really disappointed in my involvement in those with the reformist parts of it because it really ended up guiding the action. But the day-to-day living of those encampments, I think, was super important and super life-changing. Because I had students in those who were like, "Oh my God, we've been reading about anarchism, and this is we're doing it."
Mm.
And that I think that is an important resource here in the U.S. And then as some friends have done this analysis of Gaza, right? Like my friend Adi, who wrote the Gaza Ghetto Uprising article, they're saying that the example of Hamas and other people in Gaza breaking through that wall is incredibly important globally, right? Some people want to say that they're a vanguard of revolution and that we need to learn from them. I don't know to what extent that's true, but the fact that they did that, the fact that they showed Israel's weakness in that way and put people on their back foot to a certain extent is important because I think like since the 60s, 70s revolutionary moments, which were much more militant than our current ones because they were armed, right? And because police repression worked a little bit differently. This is one of the most significant like armed struggles, which ultimately, going back to the military, there's gonna have to be some kind of weaponry involved in this. And we don't, as opposed to people from the 60s and 70s, like a lot of people who are actually like committed radicals or anarchists don't have experience of battle. But like people can take that into the radical movements.
So yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things history can be, so to zoom out sort of geopolitically a little bit, right? Like history can be really funny in that the first victim of Al-Aqsa flood was actually not, it was not Netanyahu or the Zionist regime. It wasn't Hamas or the PA or, I mean, Hezbollah's weaker. It wasn't any of the forces directly involved in the war, but it was Bashar al-Assad, right?
Yeah.
Assad, who had seemingly drowned a revolution successfully in blood, a revolution that, by the way, tankies, I think the most successful and dangerous thing the tankies have done in the US in the Anglophone context was muddy the waters on Syria enough that most people sort of said, it's complicated, I don't want to think about it.
Right.
And anarchists have largely responded by adopting, the LPJ and Rojava, and like that, is for obvious reasons. There's a lot of like really incredible stuff going on in the autonomous region in Northeast Syria. It's really, really cool what's happening. There's like a sort of feminist revolution, but that's also like a more traditional, like nationalist, sectarian, like independence movement in many ways, with some things that are cooler about it than many of those. Like it is definitely like an actually liberatory one, but it's a more traditional sort of militant nationalist uprising in the way that like happened in the 60s, for example, right? Driven by a political party that like represents an ethnic group, like, and again, that is a gloss that is not, it's still ridiculous how little Western people know about what's going on with Rojava, how little they understand what's happening there, how many of them don't even know what Rojava means, right? But there was also a Syrian revolution that preceded it that was from, 2011 during Arab Spring through basically 2014 that featured like Paris Commune style neighborhood councils in every city in Syria that wasn't under iron fist by the regime, like these massive like people's hospitals, these crazy experiments in like bottom up anarchist sort of non-violent but like revolutionary or non-militant, I would say, revolutionary practice, stuff that we like fetishize now about the Black Panthers. They were building these forms in the midst of a civil war, and that movement was drowned in blood.
Right.
Like Zendaya, like when they emptied Zendaya prison, like the horror of the Assad regime that there was just that Syrians knew and that allies of Syrians knew about, but that other people didn't. That it was a regime based on a death camp. At the heart of this regime was a death camp, right? This prison, Zendaya, and because of the war that was pursued by Netanyahu, but that was begun by that act of resistance and rebellion by Hamas, destabilized Hezbollah and Iran and Russia who is, trapped in their own imperialist, whatever, boondoggle enough that Assad had become a total paper tiger, right? And he fell within weeks. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that like things are good or like HTS is going to be great. Like they just seem to be like, they seem more neoliberal than Islamofascist, like, which is good, I guess, but like it's not great. Like things are going to
Right.
be ugly and complicated for a while. But one of the greatest enemies of liberation on the planet, Bashar al-Assad, who should go down in history with names like Hitler and Mussolini, he killed 500,000 people, 100,000 of them in death camps in
Yeah.
Syria in that civil war. Truly one of history's great monsters. He fell. And he fell because of dominoes that were started by the acts of resistance in Al Aqsa flood. All of which, I'm bringing into and connects to the present because we are in an era of revolution, counter revolution, fascism, and collapse. When that happens, people take bold actions and they reverberate in complicated ways. The reason that the US state and the US system persisted for at least 150 years, if not all the way back to the Constitution. I think that whatever, that's a historical argument. Like part of the reason it was is because it was relatively predictable. They managed to more or less within their sphere of influence create predictable outcomes. That power has been falling apart since Iraq, right? And now, as you said, like this has been building for a long time. DHS, the last thing that's on Trump's side, like was built by Bush, like in the war on terror, right? That order has now come to an end. And it ended also in Al Aqsa flood. Because I think that the second victim of Al Aqsa flood was the US Constitutional Republic.
Hmm.
I think there's no way Trump wins if it isn't for Gaza. And in fact, like they've done, even liberals do these, surveys that show that like people stayed home for Kamala who would have gone out, and that was more than the margin. Trump actually
Yeah.
won by a very small margin, blah, 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 etc. So the uprising in Gaza has already overthrown one of the most vicious dictatorships of the 20th century and one of the most powerful states in world history. That is huge. That is huge. And that doesn't happen without Al Aqsa flood. That doesn't mean they caused it directly. It doesn't mean they're heroes and we have to imitate them or like embrace Hamas, who is like a conservative movement in many ways. But it does mean that we have to like, when we think about geopolitics, we have been trained by the tankies to think like obedient, quote unquote, anti-imperialist, which is to say US interests bad, US intervention bad, anyone else good. And some of us resist that and they say that's bullshit. Russia's also an imperialist force, China's also an imperialist force, which is accurate and correct. And I am one of those people.
Yeah.
But we still think in terms of a stable geopolitical system that has been dominated by an American system of power for our entire lifetimes. And that's understandable because that hasn't changed. It is changing now incredibly rapidly.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily good. That doesn't mean things are going to get better for us. But it
Right.
definitely means that one of our greatest enemies, one of the enemies that was going to be the hardest to overthrow, has killed itself. It has
Hmm.
thrown itself into the dustbin of history, and it has done so in order to punish Palestinians for daring to fight back, right? It has destroyed itself on the floodwaters of Al-Aqsa, right? Of the Al-Aqsa flood. And that has not been good for your average Gazan, obviously. Like this has been, like again, like the reaction of the empire to these changes has been so violent and extreme that they're ripping themselves apart over it.
Right.
So when we think about the US situation and resistance, and we think about like, okay, so I don't think Trump is in power if it isn't for the war in Gaza.
I agree.
And I don't think that the capitalists back him if like to the extent that they did, if they realize what he's actually going to do. They have continued to convince themselves, just like the capitalists in Weimar Germany convinced themselves that Hitler wasn't going to be so bad. They have
Right.
convinced themselves that he didn't mean it. And then on day one, he was like, no, I meant all of it. And it's
Right.
taken a month for people to catch up with that, which is frustrating, and time is of the essence. But the military hates Pete Hegseth. This guy's been in power for 3 weeks, and generals, like extremely disciplined high up generals, are calling him a fucking racist in the press, right?
Yeah.
That is like open mutiny for the US military in any other situation. The firing of all of the black and female heads of departments and the entire military, like JAG structure, right? The entire legal structure of the military. I understand why people respond to that and go, that's scary because that means he can install a military dictatorship. That's true. That's something you would have to do to install a military dictatorship.
Right.
You would cut off the head and you would replace it with loyalists. But if you do that at the same time that you've provoked an uprising, then what you've done is you've taken away your oppressive forces. Like Elon Musk and Doge was fucking around in payment systems. There were reports going around that Coast Guard officers, right, weren't getting their pay on time. If the National Guard, if the National Guard isn't getting paid, like these are the things that make a fascist coup into a revolution, right?
Right.
These are the things where like they have stumbled into a situation. All of this big political shit is to say that things are going to get real bad. But when I look at the balance of powers, I see a working class that's pretty well organized and has a memory of resistance. I see co-optive force, the Democrats, absolutely useless. I've barely mentioned them for a reason. They have lost the historical opportunity. Bernie Sanders maybe is doing it. He's like whipping people up, at like there's a few people who maybe could catch some of this wave. But for the most part, the Democratic Party has moved to the sidelines, has proven themselves useless. I see a repressive state that is disorganized and in the midst of intense internal fighting and bureaucratic struggle. And I see economy that's about to collapse and further agitate everyone. So I actually think the scariest scenario, this is where I was trying to go to. I think the scariest scenario right now, genuinely, is that Vance and the Silicon Valley people get together. Trump chokes on a Big Mac. Elon Musk gets a tainted line of ketamine, right? These are like the things that like things they do in Russia, right? Right. Oligarchs are always falling out of windows. That
Right.
is obviously, that's like, we are murdering them and you have to
Mhm.
accept that we're murdering them. And also we are going to say it's an accident, right? So something like that, some sort of violence like that. Vance chooses Fetterman as his VP, right? Some Democrat installs a unity government. They like shut down Doge. Maybe they prosecute the Doge kids. Who knows? Although I doubt they would do that, but maybe they do that even. They shut down Doge. They walk back the most intense things, and then they just go back into slow walking the fascist coup.
Mhm.
That's really scary to me because I could imagine it successfully demobilizing people and successfully like giving the Democrats real power. But I don't think Musk and Trump are up to it. I think this last week has shown. I mean, I just saw Trump has spent 12 of the last 30 days on the golf course. Musk looks to me like he's in classic end of a speed bender mode,
Right.
where he's like all the hours are coming back through his body at once, and he's like paranoid and burnt out and confused. And like, I don't think they're up to the task of doing what they want to do and what their people want them to do, because I think there has been too much resistance in the US and because I think people are too mobilized, not because the things they're doing wouldn't work in theory. And I think that's really important. If we don't rise up in the next 6 months, or even the next month or whatever, if this doesn't happen, if they aren't overthrown in one way or another, then this stuff will have worked. It will work. This will build a fascist state if there isn't resistance. People think that when you argue that they're being incompetent about it, that you're somehow asserting that the federal government is going to, as you said, reassert itself, magically come back into power. No, 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 it's not. It's over. It's dead. Unless something reinstates it in the next few weeks, it's over. But that doesn't mean they have successfully built a fascist dictatorship.
Right.
They have taken a bunch of steps towards a fascist dictatorship, and they've taken them too fast, and they sprinted a bunch of steps, and now they're like standing, heaving, to continue the sort of catching their breath, you know, and like to overextend this metaphor, and there's a real opportunity now to smash them, and to smash them in a way that doesn't, in fact, insist on the reinstatement of the state as it has existed up till now.
Now it's time for a break. And we're back. Again, I want to build on a lot of that. I remember the thing that I wanted to talk about, so I'm going to bring this in the next things that I say, what is the media as a force. But first, I think you're right in terms of Vance, right? Because Trump and Musk are incompetent and both possibly declining and with questionable popularity. And I mean, and Vance, obviously no one likes him, but he has a consistent ideology that that backs the kind of techno feudalism that Musk is like kind of aiming for, but he can't. I don't think he can pull off as well as like Vance, backed by Peter Thiel and what's his name, Moldbug, whatever. Yeah, so I think that scenario definitely is the scariest, and like, Vance in Germany saluting the fascist party
In
was
Munich, right?
in yeah is
Yeah.
like is really a signal to that. But okay, so to go to start there, but I want to connect back to Gaza because I think what you said in relation to Gaza and Syria is really interesting because one of the stumbling blocks people have in terms of supporting Gaza, kind of the resistance to Israel wholeheartedly, right? Like beyond saying genocide is wrong and having the kind of liberal reaction to the spectacle of mass death and the reality of mass death, because I mean that is terrible, and I think we can all sort of share that feeling. But there's a reticence, especially among the left, to back the kind of violent revolution. And there's a reason for that because, like you said, Hamas doesn't represent a total liberation, right? They're one channel that has historically been produced of anti-colonial force, and it's not a good one, even though maybe there are other people like connected in that area who have better ideas. But this is like you were saying in terms of the context of Rojava of having a kind of national liberation mindset, which the communists are still kind of behind, Tankies and others. But if you had looked at the 50s and 60s, decolonial movements didn't really work, right? In any kind of actually liberatory way, whether they were contained by the capitalist market or they led to violent dictators like other communist revolutions did. But the point that you said that I think is really important is like within those structures that are opened up by national liberation movements or, Islamofascists as decolonial forces, there are these other things happening, right? That are the things precisely that we don't hear about or get reported on. So the city councils that you were saying in Syria, even Rojava, like you said, like, and whenever I try to talk about Rojava to a student, no one's heard about it. And then whatever is happening in Gaza that we don't know, right? The kind of reproduction of life within Gaza and just the persistence of a kind of resistance, a daily resistance by the people there who aren't necessarily combatants, right? And that kind of relationship is the one that I'm really interested of late, just like what is visible and then what is invisible. And I think that's important also for us here. Like obviously uprising in the streets is very visible, but it's made possible by a bunch of invisible things that are happening all the time. And if we take, so like back to the media presents us a picture that if we take seriously, we can't imagine all these rumbling forces underneath that will open up the possibility for some kind of revolution. And so I think we need to not underestimate the media as a force of, normalizing everything, right? Even in the fact that the kind of liberal media is critical of Trump, the way that they do it makes it possible for Trump to do everything he's doing. It doesn't actually work as like hashtag resistance, or maybe it works as hashtag resistance, but not real resistance.
I don't think it's even hashtag resistance anymore. I think that the mainstream media has successfully been captured like by billionaires and by fascist forces. I think the New York Times is a fascist magazine. I think the Washington Post is largely a fascist magazine. Seattle Times, like they're not allowed to publish, or was it Seattle or was it San, I can't even remember.
It was
LA, LA.
Washington. Yeah.
Was it LA? Oh, yeah, whatever. They weren't allowed to endorse Kamala. That was LA, right? These,
Washington Post and LA Times, I think.
yeah, yeah. So I think like you're absolutely right that the media is like an incredibly important reality shaping force. And it was hugely important in normalizing Trump and making Trump's second election possible. I think the media was absolutely crucial. That's why I think, Musk's control of Twitter was crucial for that as well.
I mean, the way that they're reporting on Musk too, I think in particular is like really supporting his ability to do things, even though it's like ostensibly critical.
And that is like all authoritarian structures, a double-edged sword for them that they're holding. Because the reason that the liberal media, as it existed to some extent, was established was because it gave people a feeling that if media was covering something, then like that was in the dialogue and then that was what mattered. That's actually a fascist structure of thought, that if my voice is heard, that's enough.
Right.
Nothing has to change as long as my voice is heard. So like what the liberal, post the 60s, what the liberal establishment and what, the media and a lot of nonprofits and social movements established as the norm was
Right.
You protested to get media coverage. Getting media coverage was the victory. Maybe the media coverage led to some your lobbyists writing a bill that got considered and that got killed in committee. And by the time all that's happened, it's been 6 months, and you're on to
Mhm.
the next thing, and you're fundraising still, right? This
Right.
this this is a system of recuperation and control that was designed to stop the 60s from happening again, and it worked
Right.
for a while.
Yeah.
And like I think like the dissembling of the media, because the media is an enemy of the right, was successful in terms of putting Trump back in power. It worked. It also means that when the media is not covering this stuff, that if they're, disorganizing the FBI as they are, right? If they're disorganizing their repressive state, and he's only watching Fox News, right? And they're getting all their information from a press corps that's like increasingly limited and like blinkered. When the wave comes, they're not going to have seen it coming.
Right. And that goes back to the clandestine stuff. Like, and you've said before, like the right wing can't distinguish between Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, and anarchists or communists. Like,
Yeah, Asada Shakur, Nancy Pelosi, they're all the same to them. Yeah.
right. Yeah. The media is a place where we could imagine a kind of refusal that hasn't been happening, obviously. And we still have this kind of ideal of the journalist as speaking truth to power, which also, for the most part, doesn't happen, or gets siloed off, or a lot of those people who start that way end up going really, really bad directions.
Yeah.
But we still kind of accept that idea, and that's tied, like you said, to a kind of making of protest into spectacle over the response to the 60s and 70s, basically, where a lot of us still are captured in this idea that we're doing the thing that happened, that was productive, that relied on the media, and doesn't happen anymore. But this made me think about also what you said earlier, that the thing, like the US in its decline, has less and less been able to keep up the power structure that made people buy into it, right? And I think that obviously that's accelerated post 2000, right? Given the Supreme Court electing George Bush, and then the war is becoming super unpopular, and the Patriot Act, right? And then it's just gone worse and worse and worse over all the things that we've just been talking about. But also, obviously, like Korea and Vietnam were elements of that. The Reagan Thatcher time kind of staved it off for a bit, and Clinton, making life a little bit better for the bourgeoisie, maybe staved that off. But I think there's less and less willingness to concede to that. And that makes me think of something about the particular terrain of the US, which I think is interesting, right? Because like you said, they don't have the federal government. But the way that the US crumbles isn't as a unified state, right? Because it's this huge landmass that is held together by all these independent governments. And we're already seeing that it's like spotty who's resisting and who's complying with all of these things. And so I don't know. I wonder what you think about this, because this is something I've been thinking about back since at least 2016, about how this all plays out would be through this kind of patchwork. It's also like, as like trans people trying to figure out like what state you can like move to or from, and it's totally uneven and unpredictable. So on one hand, it's like it works to oppress us, but yeah, what do you think, like post crumbling, how that might look with the makeup of the US and how it occupies the landmass?
Yeah, I think when I think about the situation that would happen when I play out the tape, and this is based largely on sort of past revolutions, like based on past regime collapse, I think that assuming that Trump and Musk are overthrown, which is the condition for this collapse to accelerate in a political direction right now. Assuming they're overthrown and they're not just cooed by Vance, and like assuming that the federal regime is not consolidated, but in fact does die on the vine,
Mm-hmm.
right? And consolidated could mean into a fascist power, not into, the constitutional regime, which again, I don't think is coming back. Love to be wrong on that, kinda, but I don't think it's coming back. But I think that you get a provisional government of some kind, right? That they're overthrown. Someone in the process of the overthrowing, maybe the military, maybe a Democratic leader, maybe even a Republican leader, someone with a big profile, comes in as the head of a provisional government. They call for an election, an emergency election, maybe. Then there's a bunch of struggle over that. depending on how that goes, some states maybe secede, maybe they don't. Maybe the overthrowing of Trump and Musk gets all the MAGA people off their asses and they start an armed insurrection themselves, a counter-revolutionary army.
Right.
Maybe they don't. If they do, will they manage to capture a few states? I bet they could take Idaho.
Right.
Maybe that becomes, I could imagine them forming a Christo-fascist ISIS, right? A
Hmm.
sort of the Christian states of America, right? And
Yeah.
like just taking over territory through, consolidated militias that take resources from states that like the federal government, in classic provisional government fashion wouldn't really be willing to put down, maybe, right? And then you sort of have that, and then you have sort of independent cities. I think it could dissolve into a bunch of sort of corporate sovereignties as well. And I think all
Yeah.
these things will happen at once, right? So
Yeah.
I think like there will be I think there's likely to be a white supremacist, Christo-fascist ISIS. I think
Hmm.
that seems like the most reasonable strategy for the way they've been building, right?
Well,
Is like a
there's the
sort of,
techno-feudalism thing too,
right.
which I think can happen in parallel or have
They happen in
intersection.
parallel. They happen in
Yeah.
parallel. So you've got the militias, like the white supremacists forming a sort of ISIL. You've got, the Bay Area breaking out from California and becoming a techno-feudalist, company town like a Singapore, whatever, right? You've got parts of the East Coast aligning themselves with the federal government, right? Like the provisional government, like a liberal sort of concoction. And then pocketed throughout, you've got cities that are autonomous, states that are autonomous, and an increasing breakdown of anything that represents a state in most of the middle of the country. That seems to
Yeah.
me like one way this goes. I think you're right that like the states do have sort of the thing that's complicated about the US is that the states are mini governments, but they don't have their own autonomous and repressive apparatuses. Like they have national guards, and like, yes, those national guards might refuse to do Trump's orders, but like they actually, like the states, it's like, they have state troopers and they're like city police. But if there's a revolution, a lot of those people are going to have been sidelined or killed. Um, like
Hmm.
it's just like, it's going to be really messy and confusing. And it's
Right.
also going to look not that different for a lot of people. But all of that is assuming that in the middle of this, the dollar doesn't explode. Which, again, while we are recording this podcast, I think it is quite possible that Trump could send out a tweet that would explode the dollar.
Yeah.
Last week, both Musk and Trump said some of these debts are fake.
Hmm.
And they have already reneged on contracts with farmers and with like people all over the country. They have just refused to pay contracts. They refuse to pay rent. This is Musk's strategy at Twitter. This is Trump's strategy. You just don't pay contractors. That works if you're a fucking slumlord. But like if you're the US government, like the entire world economy is built on the fact that a T-bill or a US dollar, which is in fact government debt, is reliable.
Right. Right.
And if you suddenly say federal government money, not reliable, I mean, China has just crawled through a recession with the collapse of their buying power. Like, I mean, they're still kind of in it, but like China has like just managed to hold, but like they are holding so much US debt, right? They're
Yeah.
holding unfathomable amounts of US debt. If the Chinese Communist Party collapses, which is what would happen if US money stopped working, and the Chinese working class is like actually revolting, like, you know, it could trigger warlordism and like 30 years of civil war in China, which is, what has happened in the Middle East over the 20th century. Or it could trigger another proletarian revolution because like the great concentration of proletarians in the world is in Southeast Asia, right? Because if
Hmm.
China falls, so does Vietnam, probably so does North Korea, maybe Taiwan invades. Like, things get insane right away. So all of this stuff is really unknowable. History
Yeah.
tends to be weirder and more
Right.
bizarre than we anticipate. And so actually, in the end, whatever any of those scenarios that I've described for the US, total
Yeah.
economic collapse and the return of fascist power under Vance, slow decline of the US, like falling apart into pieces, all of those scenarios, massive uprising with a provisional government, now we're in a revolution. All of these scenarios, we will get through them together as communities by building mutual aid and building power. So,
Yeah.
ironically, the most important thing we can do right now, with all of that analysis of this massive global system, 400 years of history, Columbus's fucking journey is finally coming to an end, potentially. All of that analysis, what do? We cook each other dinner. And I know that's like kind of goofy, and I'm joking, and I do think there's going to be opportunities to hit the street if there aren't already. I mean, there already are opportunities. There are going to continue to be more of those, and those are going to be valuable. But we're going to need a lot of people able to feed each other, house each other, hide each other, support one another, defend against repression, support each other in prison. There's going to be a lot of tasks we're going to need to do. So if there isn't an obvious way for you to hit the street right now, and you don't like doing that in general, that's not your call. You're like me, you're older, you're like, you're tired of street fighting, whatever. Um, like there's a lot of building to do that will in fact address all of these scenarios. But the
Yeah.
other thing we need to do is accept, I think, in my opinion, obviously, I think we should accept that the constitutional regime has fallen. It might be revived. It may be set back up, but for now, it is over. There has been a break in it. At the very
Right.
least, there has been a break in it. It might get repaired, but there has been a break. That the courts are not going to stop this, that the Democrats are not going to stop this, that the people in power are absolute nihilists, derogatory. They just don't believe in anything.
Yeah.
Not they don't have an ontological belief in anything. They believe in nothing.
Yeah.
People's analysis of how this is personal interest is piss poor. Yes, it's
Right.
personal interest. Trump was going to go to jail. He has no money. Him and Musk both live on empires of debt, and
Yeah. Yeah.
empires of debt are empires of sand, and they need
Mhm.
cash to flow through them. And Trump's presidency and political career has been a big grift that flows cash through his empire. I mean, look no further than DJT, the Trump stock, or the meme coin, right? It's just getting liquidity. It just keeps rolling over the debt. Musk said at some point in 2024, if Trump doesn't win, I'm going to jail.
Right.
He
I
was
remember.
right. That was true. He was fucked. They were so over leveraged. Tesla was dropping, sales were collapsing. Their only solid business were government contracts. SpaceX ships were blowing up. Like he was hooked. Twitter was such a massive boondoggle that like a deal like that big, usually when a bank makes a deal that big, when they fund a deal like that to the tune of $40 billion, like they did with Twitter, they sell that debt immediately to private investors. They don't want to hold it
Yeah.
on their books. It
Right.
has been 2 years. The banks are still holding that debt. They're trying to sell it at 90 cents to the dollar. Now, a stock in X right now theoretically gives you access to the most powerful man in the world, and they still can't sell them, right? This is like it's a disaster.
Yeah.
So they're in some ways, Musk and Trump are just trying to run out the clock. They're keeping ahead of the Reaper, And like that is the level of self-interest, not just like I'm gonna steal from the cookie jar, right?
Right. 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 Right.
Um, and I think, which I know but like I think that a lot of people frame it as like, oh, they're gonna like take more contracts. It's like no, they already had those.
Yeah.
This is a bigger grift. This is existential for them. That's why they're willing to do anything. They don't give a fuck because they're doomed, right?
Hmm.
But the thing is, now they're just going to get ripped apart by our bare hands instead of facing the calm, legal violence of the state, which for billionaires like Musk or Trump never actually punishes them that hard.
Right. The point about debt, I think, is really important because I think, our day-to-day interaction with money it covers over the fact that it's all based on debt. And even though we like saw what happens in 2008 when debts are called to claim that the sand, the castle of sand can crumble. I think we forget that. And I think even the people who know that and operate through it, probably they believe that they're invincible to it. And so like, if that crash happens, it'll have, yeah, totally unknown consequences, though your possibilities are interesting. And I think like this is one of the hard things I come to as an anarchist with nihilistic tendencies, that actually some of these scenarios that are totally terrible open up opportunities for us. And those opportunities aren't going to be universal liberation, because I don't believe that's possible. But in the kind of splintering is where we open up things to have like pockets of liberation. And that is like maybe for me the most hopeful I get. And your emphasis on food is super important because Like it does sound silly, right? But one of the primary ways that capitalism and the state brought people into like forced people into labor was by cutting off their ability to feed themselves, and that's ultimately what we need to live. So like, while right now we are still dependent on agriculture and supply chains for our food, finding ways to feed each other shouldn't be downplayed as one of the most important, even like revolutionary acts. And that's why everyone talks about the breakfast program as the most important and threatening thing of the Black Panthers.
Right. And I think that turn towards the breakfast program like forgets that like they were funding the breakfast program by robbing banks with machine guns. Like those two things combined is what threatened the state, right? Just because the state then took the breakfast programs. They were fine with the breakfast programs happening as long as like Black revolutionaries weren't literally destroying banks to do it. Anyway.
Yeah, I was just teaching about the George Jackson Brigade, and I'm like, we need more expropriation of money for the people. We've done a lot of analysis, turning a little bit to practical things. I wanted to call back to something that you said in terms of if they had put in this wedge through anti-transness, that could have led to a more gradual takeover. And I also see their attempts at anti-trans policy to show some of the weakness. Like I've read the language of his executive order, and it's convoluted and ridiculous, and it ultimately shows that there's no way for the state to impose gender or biological distinction in a meaningful way. It needs to do all of these things to break it, to control people's bodies. And I think trans people can, I don't know, we cannot be ruled by this. We can be harmed by it, but we can't ultimately be ruled by it. So like that, I think as a political whatever maneuver, I see what you're saying in terms of how that's useful. But then as an actual political item of governance, it has an ultimate weakness to it, right? That we know that we daily resist in some possibility. So I'm maybe starting with trans people. What do you think? Where do we go beyond feeding each other? Do you have other ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I talk about the trans issues being a wedge, I mean that in the same way that regimes have used scapegoats as wedges to build power. They obviously don't actually have an analysis. Like the Nazis didn't have a convincing way to prove that the Jews ran global capital on behalf of of Bolsheviks or whatever, right? It didn't matter. Like it's not about the accuracy of that. It's about the enough of civil society accepting an on its face absurd claim in the name of backing up bias and violence that they can then begin, installing, like building the camps, like taking away people's passports, whatever. Right? It's about establishing a grounds for raw power. The ideological arguments matter. They are really shoddy. Like right now, a thing that's been going on. I think Trump's trans executive order is in one of the courts, and his lawyers are just absolutely getting eviscerated by this judge, who's just like, a judge who I mean, is just saying like this definition makes no sense. Like this doesn't make sense on its face. This is bullshit. Biological sex has no basis. This is pure bias, right?
It's decided at concept.
Yeah. It's just like it's nonsensical, right? It's like it's an utterly nonsensical structure of thought. It always has been. I think trans people for the last 2 years have already been doing the work that needs to be done because this stuff has started happening on state levels. This has been happening in Florida, in Tennessee, in Ohio,
Missouri,
and Missouri, and then like slowly spreading across, the South and the West. It's sort of everywhere now, or a lot of places anyway. And networks of medicine sharing and knowledge sharing and mutual aid, like in terms of cash sharing, have always been part of queer community, have always especially been part of trans femme community, because we do not do well with money and job opportunities and society in general. But I think that there has been an active uptick in those organizations and those forces over the last 2 years, that those forces have been largely invisible to the state because the state has been focused on other questions, and it doesn't seem important to them because they sort of look like mutual aid networks. And now the state has no idea what the fuck is going on, right? Like they're completely confused. I have seen a few people a few trans women say, and this makes me feel so amazing, say, yeah, they might take away our healthcare, but I know that there are people in my community who know how to get me medicine.
Yeah.
And like that knowledge spread fast. That knowledge spread fast and it
Right.
spread widely. And that's huge. And what that means, that's the sort of mutual aid project that like, does that mean that therefore we are immune to genocide? No.
Yeah.
But what it means is that we don't have to fight defensive battles over hormones in the courts or in the law or at a pharmacy, right? If they take them all away from all the pharmacies tomorrow, that would be horrible. Lots and lots of people would be forcibly detransitioned. It's a nightmare. This is a bad thing. This is not a good thing. We do not want this. But I think I share your sense that it's also an opportunity. It's also an opening. And like I do think that we're entering a period, we are in a revolutionary period. Revolutionary, especially for those of us who came up post-Soviet Union, revolutionary has tended to mean the good liberatory thing. But actually, eras of revolution just mean overturning of this regimes, overturning of
Right.
regimes. We entered one in 2011. That was the beginning. 2011 to 2024, maybe 2020 was the beginning
Yeah.
of a new age of revolution, from Arab Spring to Ukraine, the land wars in Europe, right? Myanmar, all over the Middle East, which I already said with Arab Spring, but in Africa as well, you know, the Hong Kong movement and putting that down, and of course the stuff in the US. 2020, I think the pandemic and the post George Floyd sort of lull that happened globally, I think we have entered the beginning of the middle. Now we're in the middle of a revolutionary phase. That means that everything is possible right now.
Yeah.
Everything is possible, including Nazis too, now with nukes, right?
Yeah.
Everything is possible. Like, it's not a fucking joke. But it means that also what is possible is like scaling up our mutual aid networks to the point where we can like literally rescue trans people from safety, defend them on the street, give them their medicine, and then like with that backup, with with the knowledge, okay, if they take away my medicine, I don't have to worry. Someone's got me. Knowing that makes it so much easier to focus on fighting something else. When we
Yeah.
get each other's basic needs met, like this is like the sort of, you know, Margaret Killjoy talks a lot about this with like community preparedness and survival, and I owe a lot of this sort of to her. I think her thinking has been really clarifying in the last few months. Like when we are prepared individually, it means that the second shit hits the fan, we're ready to go, taking care of each other because we know we don't have to scrabble for our own individual needs. That's why you get prepared, not because you're going to be a zombie apocalypse. You're going to live in a bunker with a little patriarchal family and shoot anyone who comes close. That's not what you're doing. What you're doing is making sure that you are prepared, that at the very least, you will not be another person who needs rescuing. That's
Right.
huge. Being one fewer person who needs rescuing, even if you don't have energy or capacity or ability to help other people, even that is huge.
Hmm.
And like, so that's the kind of stuff that we can do right now. That's the kind of stuff that trans communities have been doing for decades, but particularly intensely over the last 5 years. That's the kind of stuff that Black and Indigenous communities have been doing since the Great Apocalypse began in 1492. Their
Disabled communities.
disabled communities have been doing this. This is a long, long history that we have of how to do this, how to survive, how to struggle. And the thing about how to survive, how to struggle, how to get organized is that it does respond to conditions and things do get worse and we lose people. It's not fun. It's not great, but it's here.
Right.
It's here.
I think, yeah. So, like, going back to the kind of invisible thing, like, power, also, power doesn't see it in terms of what you were saying, like, in like how trans people, particularly trans women, like, reproduce their daily lives. And the history of it is really important, like, that, like, the history of trans existence, as we, whatever, using the word trans to mean a lot of different things, has been a knowledge of manipulating systems, moving in and out of them, sharing information, taking care of each other, like, modes of survival that aren't like glamorous all the time and they're very dangerous and precarious. But that knowledge, and there's a historical knowledge of that that's passed down that's different from other places. And what I think is really important about the things you're saying is like these aren't political in the sense that we understand political like action or political organization. These are like daily practical ways of living. And instead of looking to the left, the organized left, like the people who know how to do shit are people who aren't necessarily engaged in all that process because also it's absorbed by the government. Like Joy James calls it neo radicalism, and we're the loyal opposition, right? It's like the people. It's like it's disabled organization of taking care of each other. It's trans people taking care of each other. And that I agree is like where the most hope is for us that like many of us are already doing this in ways and we have a history of it and it's actually intergenerational, unlike, anarchism for many and definitely like, other political organizations. So I think that's just, yeah, I just want to emphasize that because like you've been writing about, people forget that you're already in the midst of doing the thing that you need to do.
And living through collapse, I think a lot of people, if they read about this stuff at all, they try to read about it from a high level, like revolutions or collapses. They tend to read about it from a high level political way, right? And the left has been really dogmatic about that. Read Lenin, like the dude who did, whatever. But like even people with better, you tend to read political accounts of it. But I find that in moments like this, the stuff that's really valuable and has been valuable and that I've been thinking about are novels and films
Yeah.
about what is it like to live through those things. They're not factually accurate, but they're emotionally correct. And they understand what it's like. And what it's like often is daily life, but things are less reliable. And then
Yeah.
suddenly there's a big protest and you got to go, or there's a disaster and you got to respond to it. But like you're already doing it. You're already living through the collapse. That's why I keep insisting that the constitutional republic is over. It's not a crisis that we're looking to stop. The constitutional republic can be reinstated. I think that's still possible, but we are in a break. It is over. It is not to be defended. It is not to be saved. Not that we would want to anyway, but even if that felt urgent, it's too late. It's not possible now. If that felt urgent to you, that was 2024, right? That was when you could have done it. And like the fact that not everyone really appreciated that, or that liberals were saying that, but then not acting like it, doesn't make it less true. Just because liberals said it and didn't respond to it with actual strategic necessity or with anything like what is morally or ethically appropriate doesn't mean that like there wasn't truth to their analysis that like Trump was an imminent threat. It's very obvious. He was an imminent threat. Day one, he started ripping apart the constitutional order. The fact that they were right doesn't make that less true. And we have to not do this sort of reflexive contrarianism because none of us have been in this situation before. No one in America has lived through the collapse of American power, except for, I think I would argue, people from 1850 to 1877. But again, that's a historical debate, whatever. And like, it doesn't, and ultimately it was reestablished. But like, we talk about the Civil War like it could only ever end with the reestablishment of the Union.
Right.
Because that's the mythology of the current regime. Well, that current regime is over. That regime is dead. The regime that won the Civil War is no longer in control. The Confederates have the wheel, if you want to be really vulgar about it. And since we have never lived, and no one in living memory has lived through this, in the US, it feels apocalyptic because it is kind of apocalyptic. It's just the apocalypse for something that we want to die.
Yeah.
But people in the post-Soviet world, people all over the Middle East, all over East Africa, all over the former Soviet Union, like have lived through this recently. They have lived through this regime change. People in Europe who are over 90 or 80 remember regime change. If you're in Greece, you only have to be 70 to remember it, right?
Right.
This is living memory for lots of people. If you're Spanish, you only have to be 60, right? It's like
In South
70s.
America too, there's
Yeah, of course. No, absolutely. And so people live through these scenarios of collapse. What is interesting, what is offering a lot of opportunities is that if the US collapses, like we said, then the global economy collapses, and then things get really weird really fast. And that's really scary. And that'll be really bad. And that'll have a lot of suffering. And it will also mean huge opportunities for transformation and huge opportunities for change. And we're going to lose people. And the better we're ready to give each other food and to give each other medicine and to know who needs what and who has what in our communities. And the more ready we are to take what we need, regardless of the law, and the more ready we are to take what we need from the places where it is, no matter what, when we're ready to do those things, the more ready we are, the more of us are going to make it.
Yeah. It's really hard to accept the fact that in all of this, many of us will suffer and many of us will die. Like I've said this before, like I don't want to will that into
No,
existence, but it's like a thing.
I
Yeah.
think I think one thing we could do sort of ideologically, theoretically for ourselves right now that would be so valuable. Everyone should practice this, just like as a mantra, right? Describing the situation as it is not endorsing it.
Yeah.
Describing the situation as it is not endorsing it. Describing possibilities that open up in collapse is not rooting for collapse. Recognizing things as they really are, soberly and seriously looking at the situation is not the same as endorsing the situation. And it is the first and most important step to be able to move in ways that really save each other.
Yeah. And I want to bring it back to the thing you just said, which I think is important. And it's something I truly believe. Like the learning from fiction and, whether it's novels, stories, or movies is actually, I think, more important than history. I think people get deluded from history because they think they're going to learn blueprints or, just like it gets used mostly in a political way, as you're saying, to kind of, I think, restrain the imagination. And I'm not saying like it's useless, obviously, but when it's the only political tool that you're using for thinking of the future, I just think we get led astray by it. And the practicing of imagination and the actual experience that you can have of freedom through art is important. And it's important to hold on to that. And it is another thing that you can experience in your daily life immediately, unlike a lot of the other things. Well, I mean, we've talked about a lot. So, do you want to have any final words?
No, I mean, I think, other than a shout out for history, I think history is useless without film or novels. I genuinely think it's useless, but I also think if you're into history, add some fiction to it and it'll actually help you. If you don't add
Yes.
any fiction to it, it won't help you at all. I agree with that.
Right.
Um,
Those
uh,
people who are like, I only read history because fiction's made up, like,
yeah,
mm-mm.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's only written by the people who are living through the history, it's no big deal. Yeah. So anyway, take care of one another, build power, take one step every day towards mutual aid. If that's just sending a text to a group chat or forming a group chat, or getting to know a neighbor, or having tea with a friend and discussing your plan for if the power goes out, or, getting some food prepared communally. Take one step every day, just one. It only has to take 5 minutes. Take one step every day towards building this power, and you will, in in no time at all, you will have done so much more than you think is possible. And organizing is not some specialized or special thing. We all do it all the time. If you've ever thrown a party, if you've ever maintained a D&D game, if you've ever, hosted an event, you have done organizing. Organizing
Right.
is like party planning with political intent, Um, and
It's
like,
my Mrs. Dalloway theory of anarchism, is what I
yes,
call
I love it. I love it. So yeah, so I think take one step every day, recognize when you're doom spiraling and have a plan in place to pull yourself out of it. You can pay attention to the news. You can post if it feels good, but make sure if it's not feeling good. I'm just talking to
it.
myself as much as anything now.
Yeah.
Like we don't know what's going to work. We don't know what's going to happen. So try everything as long as it isn't feeling like self-harm or like destruction to yourself
Right.
and your loved ones. Try things, experiment with things, be bold, be brave. We got this.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, yeah, I would just say that Vicky has been writing a lot of really inspiring and helpful pieces that you can find at cawshinythings.com, where I
Woo-hoo.
also contribute. And, in defense of history, your book, In Defense of Looting, is actually, I think, a history that gives us the possibility of imagination and inspires. At least that was my experience reading it. And I don't know, you have another book coming out. If you want to mention it, we can
Oh
put that
yeah,
on.
yeah. Assuming there's still an economy, next year I'll have a book coming out called The Extended Universe, which is a history of Disney intellectual property and how the world has been shaped by intellectual property management, which doesn't feel super urgent right now, but I think it will be helpful if we do recover. If the economy does recover from where we're at, it will be a helpful analysis. And if not, it'll just go out anyway. It'll be cool. It'll be a fun book about how Disney sucks.
Well, thank you, Vicky, for talking with me. And
yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Thanks everybody for listening. If you made it this far, y'all rock. Love y'all.
Bye. You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Rate, follow, and share us with your exes. Until next time.